The grocery list was always written on the back of an envelope or a piece of brown paper, the items listed in Mama's careful handwriting. The list meant that we were not going to wander the store aimlessly, picking things based on desire or impulse. The list meant that every item had been thought about before we entered the store, had been weighed against other needs, had been determined to be necessary in a way that only necessity could determine. I learned to read long before I started school by studying these lists, by understanding that the words on them translated into meals that would be stretched across days, that would nourish us, that would have to be accounted for. Mama's purse held a change purse within it, and within that change purse was the money for groceries. I knew not to ask for things that were not on the list. I knew this not because I had been explicitly told, though I had been, but because I had absorbed it from the way Mama moved through the store, from the way her eyes tracked prices, from the set of her mouth when she made a decision to buy something or put it back. There was an arithmetic happening in her head constantly, a calculation that involved more than simple addition and subtraction. It involved the knowledge of what her money could stretch to, what could be made to feed all of us, what was essential, and what was expendable. The store nearest us was a small neighborhood place, the kind that existed before supermarkets became the way most people shopped. The owner knew most of the people who came in, knew their names, knew their situations. There was a book, an actual ledger, that kept track of what people owed when they bought on credit. The shame of that ledger existed but was also managed carefully. It was not spoken about, but it was understood. At certain times, when money came in, people would come and settle what was owed, and then the cycle would begin again. I was maybe 7 years old the first time I understood that we were buying on credit, that the money in Mama's change purse was not enough for what we actually needed. The realization did not arrive as a shock. Instead, it came quietly, almost as something I had always known but was only now able to name. We were at the store, and Mama was buying the things on her list: flour, rice, beans, some vegetables, a small piece of meat for seasoning. The total came to more than the money she had with her. The store owner wrote something in his ledger. Mama's face remained the same, polite, calm, controlled. But I felt something shift, a small knowing that had not been there before. What I did not understand then was the dignity in that moment. I see it now, looking back, the way the store owner handled it. No shame, no lecture, just a simple transaction of trust. The way Mama accepted it, with thanks, with the implication that this would be set right, with the maintenance of her dignity throughout. But what I felt then was something more like anxiety, a kind of low-level worry that settled into my chest and stayed there. We did not have enough. This was something that required understanding and acceptance. The house we lived in was small and old, but it was kept meticulously. This was not because we had much, but because Mama believed that how you maintained what you had mattered more than what you had. The floors were swept every morning. The furniture, which was mostly old and hand-me-down, was cleaned and dusted. The windows were washed regularly. Everything had a place, and everything stayed in its place. Waste was not tolerated. Nothing was thrown away that could be used for something else. Clothes were mended immediately when they tore. Nothing was purchased new if it could be found used and was still serviceable. I remember sitting on the front steps with my older cousin, who had come to stay with us for a while. She was maybe 15, and she was looking at her shoes, which were clearly wearing through at the heel. I asked her why she didn't just get new shoes. She looked at me like I had said something that did not quite make sense. "We can't just get new shoes," she said, not unkindly, just factually. And then she pulled out a needle and thread, and she began to patch the shoe as best she could. It would not be perfect. It would not last forever, but it would last a while longer, and in the meantime, she would not be barefoot. The question I had asked, "Why don't you just get new shoes?" revealed something about my own lack of understanding at that point, or perhaps it revealed that I had been protected somewhat from the full weight of economic reality, that the careful management was happening around me without my being forced to understand it completely. My cousin, who was older, had fewer layers of protection. She understood the calculus more directly. Mama's clothes were minimal. A few work dresses that she wore during the week, a nicer dress for Sunday, an old coat. She had a pair of everyday shoes and a pair for going out. Everything was clean. Everything was pressed. Everything looked respectable. She did not look poor, which I think was the point. Or rather, she looked poor, but she did not look defeated. She did not look like someone who had given up. She looked like someone who was managing, who had standards, who believed that how you presented yourself to the world mattered because the world was already predisposed to judge you based on what it saw. My own clothes came from hand-me-downs when possible, from the clearance rack when necessary. Some of my clothes had belonged to older cousins. Some had belonged to the children of people Mama knew. Some had been bought at discount stores, the kind where the clothes were cheaper because they were less fashionable or had some small imperfection. I did not resent this. I did not feel particularly deprived, but I was aware of it. I noticed which girls at school had new clothes, which girls had clothes that fit perfectly, which girls did not have to think about their clothes at all. The Sunday school dress was the exception. There was money set aside for a proper Sunday school dress, and when the time came to get it, we went to a real store and picked out something that was actually new, actually purchased for me. This dress was made of a better material. It had details that were decorative rather than purely functional. It represented something, a commitment to respectability, to showing up appropriately, to honoring the Sabbath. The dress was kept carefully, worn only for its intended purpose, and it lasted for years as I grew into it and then grew out of it. Food was where the arithmetic of care became most visible. Meals were constructed from basic ingredients: rice, beans, flour, vegetables. Meat was expensive, so a small piece of meat was used to flavor a whole pot of something else. Nothing was wasted. The bones went into the pot to make broth. The vegetable scraps went into a pot of water that simmered on the back of the stove. Bread that was going stale was torn up and saved for cornbread dressing. Leftover rice became fried rice. Leftover vegetables were added to soups. There was skill in this, real skill. It was not just thriftiness, though there was plenty of that. It was knowledge about how to cook, about how flavors work together, about how to stretch a meal. Watching Mama cook was like watching someone do mathematics with their hands and their palate. She would taste something and know what it needed. She would combine things in ways that seemed to make sense only in retrospect, that could not have been predicted beforehand, but once combined, felt inevitable. Certain meals meant certain things. Beans and rice was a weekday meal, filling and cheap. Biscuits and gravy was breakfast, and the gravy was made with the drippings from meat and flour and milk, and it could turn a simple biscuit into something that felt substantial. Fish on Friday was church tradition, and also practical because fish was cheaper than other meats. And then there were the meals that came on special occasions: Sunday dinner, a birthday, a holiday, when Mama would stretch the budget further and cook something that felt celebratory. A chicken that had been carefully saved for, a cake made from scratch, a dessert that was not an everyday thing. I did not go hungry. This is important to say clearly. We always had food, but there was a consciousness to eating that some children did not have. We did not waste food. We did not eat more than was proportional. We did not ask for seconds without knowing that there would be enough. We understood that the food on the table was food that Mama had managed to provide, and that understanding was present in every bite. There was a woman who lived 2 streets over who would sometimes give Mama vegetables from her garden. These were gifts, offered in a way that did not feel like charity, but like one person sharing an abundance with another. Mama would receive them gratefully, and then she would make something special with them. A dish that used the good vegetables prominently, that made them the center of attention rather than an afterthought. It was her way of honoring the gift, of acknowledging that the vegetables represented generosity, and of ensuring that generosity was not wasted. Charity was a complicated thing in the neighborhood. There was giving between people, always, but there was also a careful maintenance of dignity in that giving. You did not want to be seen as someone who had to accept handouts. You did not want to be indebted in a way that was visible, so the giving happened carefully, quietly, in ways that allowed the person receiving to maintain their sense of self. A casserole left on the doorstep, vegetables offered from a garden, Hand-me-down clothes passed along as something that the person giving did not need anymore, not as something new being purchased for charity. The school supply list every year was something that created a moment of tension. The list was not particularly long and the items were not particularly expensive, but they all added up to something that required thinking about. Pencils, notebooks, erasers, crayons. Some of these items were purchased, some of them were left over from previous years, some of them were improvised. You learned to erase pencil marks with care so you could reuse the notebook pages. You learned to sharpen pencils with a knife if a sharpener was not available. These were not presented as deprivations. They were just the way things were done. What I am trying to describe is the way that scarcity became the ordinary texture of life. Not a crisis point, but a constant awareness that had to be managed. It was not dramatic. There was no moment of crisis that I remember, no night without food, no essential need that went unmet, but there was the constant arithmetic, the constant calculation, the constant knowledge that things were being managed carefully, and that careful management was what made everything possible. Mama worked during the day doing domestic work for white families. She was gone before I left for school, and often did not return until after school was finished. The money from this work was what kept us. It was not enough money, it was never enough money, but it was what we had. And Mama did this work with a kind of professionalism that I understood, even as a child, was a kind of armor. The work was real, the skill was real, but the context was also real, and the context was not one that she could change. When Mama came home, her feet hurt. I know this because I could see it in the way she moved, the way she sat down, the way she did not get up again until it was time to cook dinner. Sometimes she would talk about the families she had worked for that day. Not gossip exactly, but observations. The way they lived, the size of their houses, the number of things they had. She would observe these things without bitterness, but also without the kind of approval that might have come from someone who thought that way of living was actually better or more correct. What she was doing, I think, was teaching me something about the world that I could not have learned any other way. She was showing me that there were different ways of living, different amounts of money, different levels of comfort, and she was also showing me, through her own bearing and her own dignity, that how you lived was not necessarily a reflection of who you were, that you could have less money and still have integrity, that you could do work that was undervalued and still value yourself. There was a day when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. I had been invited to a birthday party for a girl at school. The party was in a neighborhood that was different from my own, nicer houses, more space, clearly more money. I remember being aware that my clothes were not as nice as some of the other girls' clothes, that my shoes were not as new, that my socks did not match in the way that seemed to matter to the other children. I remember feeling a kind of shame about this, a sense that I was somehow less than because of these material differences. When I came home and told Mom about the party, I mentioned offhandedly the other girls' clothes, the cake they had had, which was from a bakery, not homemade, the presents. I was not asking for these things. I was just reporting what I had observed. But Mama, who was preparing dinner, set down her knife and looked at me. "You know what matters," she said, "how you treat people, whether you keep your word, whether you do what you say you're going to do, not what shoes you're wearing." It was not a rebuke, it was a statement, and it was delivered in a way that was not mean-spirited toward the other girls or their families. It was just a clarification of values. What matters is not the same as what is visible. I carried that with me, though I did not fully understand it at the time. I had been given a kind of permission, I think, to not accept the world's valuation of people based on what they owned. It did not make me immune to wanting things or feeling the lack of them, but it gave me a framework for understanding that wanting and that lack as something separate from my own worth. The house, though small and old, was a home in a way that I did not fully appreciate until much later. It was a space where I was loved, where I was safe, where the management of scarcity was not my burden to carry alone, but a shared responsibility that was handled by people who were experienced at handling it, where dignity was maintained, not in spite of limited resources, but through the intelligent and careful use of those resources. Mama's hands were not soft. They were the hands of someone who did physical work, who had been doing physical work for years. They were capable hands. They could cook, clean, sew, heal small injuries, braid hair, manage a household. These hands were the hands that made everything possible, that translated a small amount of money into meals and clean clothes and a home that was respectable. These hands were the hands that held me when I was sick, that comforted me, that guided me. And they were also the hands that worked for other people, that moved through other people's homes, that did work that was taken for granted. I did not have the language then to understand what I was witnessing. I understand now that what Mama was doing, what many mothers and grandmothers in similar circumstances were doing, was a kind of resistance. Not dramatic resistance, not resistance that announced itself, but resistance nonetheless. It was a refusal to be diminished by circumstance. It was a commitment to maintaining standards, to valuing things that could not be bought, to believing that dignity and love and care mattered more than money. What I did not understand until I was much older was how heavy this work actually was. Not just the physical work of the job she worked, though that was heavy, and I could see it in the way her body felt when I hugged her at the end of the day, but the emotional work of managing scarcity while protecting children from the weight of it, the work of teaching values when those values ran counter to the messages the world was sending about what mattered and what did not, the work of maintaining standards for yourself and your children when those standards were not being recognized or valued by anyone else. I had an economics class in high school much later where we learned about budgeting and household finances. As I listened to the teacher explain how families should allocate their money, I thought about the way Mama had allocated our money. She was doing everything the teacher said you should do, budgeting carefully, planning ahead, avoiding unnecessary expenses, prioritizing needs over wants, while operating on a budget that would have terrified the families of most of my classmates. There was no margin for error. There was no buffer for unexpected expenses. Everything had to work perfectly, or the whole thing would collapse. But it did not collapse. We were fed, we were clothed, we were sheltered, we were cared for, and we were also taught, through the daily evidence of how our household was managed, something about discipline, about thinking ahead, about the value of things that were not obvious. We were taught that love expressed itself not just in words or in special occasions, but in the steady, daily work of care. There is something that gets lost in talking about childhood poverty, something that can get lost in either direction, either in romanticizing it or in pitying it. What gets lost is the actual experience of it, which is not dramatic most of the time. It is quiet. It is the small decisions that adults make. It is the knowledge held in the body of how much things cost. It is the watching of another person's face as they make a decision about whether something is worth the money. It is the understanding, which comes very slowly and very naturally, that resources are finite and that finite resources require careful thought. I was not poor in a way that was entirely separate from my identity. Being the kind of child who was clothed and fed and sheltered, but always with the awareness that these things were managed carefully, that they did not simply happen, but were created through work and intention. This shaped who I was becoming. It shaped how I thought about money, about work, about what mattered. It shaped a kind of consciousness that I carried with me into a different kind of life, a life with more material security. And that consciousness, that awareness, that literacy in the language of scarcity and care became a gift, though I could not have understood it as such at the time. The arithmetic of our household was not a sad arithmetic. It was not a failure. It was the arithmetic of people who knew how to be alive with limited resources, who had learned to do that from people before them who had also known it and who were passing that knowledge on. The skill of it, the dignity of it, the love that was embedded in every careful decision. These were things that no amount of money could purchase. These were things that could only be created through intention and care and the daily choice to maintain standards, even when maintaining them cost more than simply letting them go. Mama's list still comes to mind sometimes when I make my own decisions about money, about what to spend and what to save. And I think about the store owner with his ledger, keeping track of who owed what, managing a system of trust and credit that allowed people to feed their families even when their money ran short. I think about the woman with the garden, sharing vegetables as a gift that was also a kind of wisdom. I think about the casual way that hand-me-downs moved through the community, allowing resources to be stretched across multiple children, multiple families, multiple years. What I am trying to say is that scarcity, when managed with dignity and with love, becomes something else. It becomes an education, it becomes a transmission of values, it becomes a kind of knowledge that cannot be taught in schools but only lived. And for people who lived it, who survived it, who made it work, who raised children within it, it was not a lack, but a different kind of abundance. An abundance of skill, of connection, of understanding about what mattered and what did not. I think sometimes about the choices that were made, the carefully managed budget, the food that was stretched across days and made into meals that were delicious and nourishing. I think about the clothes that were mended and worn and passed along. I think about the dignity that was maintained in spite of it all, or perhaps because of it all. And I understand that this was not a period of deprivation that I survived and then moved past. It was a formation. It was an education. It was a transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next about how to live, how to love, how to maintain yourself when the world was not particularly interested in maintaining you.